Welcome to Cheap Controls. We make videos on things that we struggled with, hoping to help you so you don't. Consider subscribing and hitting that bell.
In this one, I thought I was just going to go over JavaScript and MySQL, but I'm going to add some PHP also. So we're going to use the JavaScript to access the PHP, which is then going to make a MySQL query. When we left off, I had it set up about like this. None of the other pages worked. The only change I made is I put the measurements that I'm going to take for the preceding examples. I'm not 100% sure I'll get RPM, but volts and temps should be pretty easy to collect and store. And for the index.html portion of it, I just went through here and changed the words to volts, and then I made the ID volt, temp, and RPM. And so that way when we go to adjust those areas of the HTML page, we'll be able to pull the IDs for those. What we'll focus on for this video is going to be the limits, the lower and upper limits. And for that I have volt lower, volt upper, temp lower, temp upper, and RPM lower, RPM upper. The other thing that I've added is I've added a JavaScript directory, which I have JS. And then I have a PHP directory, PHP. And then I have two test files. It's going to be test.js for the JavaScript and test.php for the PHP file. And right now they're empty. We're going to start in the JS file. I am assuming that you've downloaded XAMPP, X-A-M-P-P, on your computer and have it set up. And if you haven't, you might want to pause this and look that up. I will put a post up on that on the web page. But if you look it up, there's a lot of videos on YouTube on how to install it. And that's how you'll run the PHP and connect it to the MySQL. The XAMPP install includes PHP and MySQL in the install, so it makes it fairly easy. And for the JavaScript, we're going to create a function called load limits. And when you create a function, you have the option of making it asynchronous. So in other words, it'll start and run, and then other things can operate at the same time. It's load limits equals an async function. And then this arrow, they call it an arrow function, the equal sign and then greater than sign, and then the curly brackets, and then the function will go in between those. I'm going to print out a little message on the console, and you'll see that on the HTML page or in the browser. I'll show you that. I'm just going to say load limits. And then we're going to create a form. And in that form, we're going to take data, and that's what we're going to send to the PHP script. And in this case, I'm going to have two things on the form. And you have to think of the first, this function and hello. The function and hello are variables. And then for function, we're going to store get limits in it. And for hello, I'm going to store the word world in it. And I'm not going to use the second one. I just did it to illustrate the principle. And you'll see this later on, once again, on the browser page. And then if you notice, I used the word let up here. I don't know if you're familiar with JavaScript, but for those that aren't, when you assign a variable, you have a couple of options. You can use nothing and just have form data equal new form data. Or, and that's true for any variable, x equals 1. And the old way to do it was var, use var, and then form data. But I prefer let, because let, I'll copy this. If you use let and you assign the same variable twice, you'll notice that it gives you an error. Whereas if you use var, you don't get that error, and you can mistakenly assign a variable twice. And then we're going to use this fetch to call the php/test.php. And if you'll notice, I have the directory PHP, and then I have test.php in it. And this is sometimes referred to as a promise. So what we're going to do is we're going to fetch, we're going to send code to that, and we're going to await for a reply. In this case, we're going to send a post request, and we're going to include this form data, this data that we have up here. And then when we get our response, it's going to come back in a format too, so we'll have to create limit data, Since I'm going to get the limits, I'm using the word limit. And it's going to be equal to the limit response, and we're going to decode it as JSON format. And the reason I use JSON is because it's a format that both JavaScript and PHP recognize. So I'll encode it as JSON in PHP and then send it back. And then it'll be stored in this limit data variable. It'll be stored as an array. And then once we get that data back, we can use it. So you'll notice out here at the end I have limit data, and then it's an associative array. So I can use the words. When we create the PHP, we'll have it come back with volt lower being equal to a value, volt upper being equal to a value. So we can use those names over here and we can assign it to our IDs. The pound symbol denotes the ID. So volt lower is going to be assigned to the array volt lower. If I go to this index, you can see that's where I have it in here. When we create the function, it doesn't actually execute it. It just sits there. So you can assign that function to a button on the page, or you can have it run at different times. But for our case, we're going to run it the first time it opens this code. So when it opens test.js, it's going to run it one time. It doesn't run this over and over. It just executes the code once. It creates the function up here, and then this tells it to go ahead and run that function. Now over here in the PHP file, you have to surround your script with the PHP tags. So you have to put this less than question mark PHP, and then at the bottom you have to have a question mark greater than. And I'll show you what you see if you don't put that in there. And you can see how all the text I've just added is white. But now I'll go back and put those tags back in. And now, since it's between the tags, the interpreter, or this editor, knows to treat it as PHP, and so it color codes it so that it helps you see the code a little more clearly. And since PHP is going to be the scripting language we use to access the database, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get some variables from an external file. Now, in this case, this code is never going to be on a computer that's on the internet. So I don't really need to hide the username, password, and that information. And I'll show you in a couple more lines where you could just leave all this out if you don't want to do it. But in this case, I'm going to use this config variable. And I like the fact you have to put this $sign in front of a variable, because that kind of takes me back to some older coding days. But I'm going to use this variable, and I'm going to parse a file. And I'm going to pull the server name, username, password, and database name out of that file. And so I'm sitting at the C drive in the XAMPP directory, htdocs, tester, and PHP. And this .. / moves us back one directory. So we're going to go back 1, 2, 3 directories. So we'll go 1, 2, 3 to the XAMPP directory. And then you can see we're looking for the includes folder. That's right here. And then within that folder, I'm looking for the tester contents. And I have that right here, or the tester.ini. And in this folder, I have server name equal to localhost, username equal to root, password equal to nothing. I don't have a password on it for this example. And the database name is going to be tester. I haven't created it yet, but that's what I'm going to make it. So you can see I don't have a lot of security on this anyway. So we're going to take there over here, and we're going to define this DB server as the server name, DB user as the username, DB password as the password name, and DB name as the DB name. But I have to be careful, because if I've already defined them, I'll get an error. So over here, I say, is DB server defined? And I do that for each one of these. And this is a ternary operator. So if it's defined, I do whatever's after the question mark. And in this case, null. Don't do anything. So if it's defined, don't do anything. If it's not defined, then do what's after the colon. In this case, then we define it. Well, since I'm going to be starting it every time, it won't be defined, so it should work just fine. But this is just a quick way to check it. Then our next step is we're going to connect to the database. And I'm going to use this variable called conn for connection. I'm going to create a new connection, and I'm going to use what's called PDO in PHP. That's just the way that you connect to the database. And you have to, it's just this one long string. I broke it up into 2 lines to make it easier for the video. But you have to set the host name, which is DB server, the database name, which is DB name, and then you see this comma, and then you need the user, the password, and then these variables out here help to encode it. And I've done this so many times now, I just cut and paste this. I can't really remember what these mean. If you wanted to skip all this up at the top, you could just put host equals localhost, database name, tester, and make this one long string. And then instead of using these down here, I could put root and then nothing down here. It'd have to be in quotes, but it'd be quotes, R-O-O-T, quote, and then just quote, quote, and then the rest of it. The other thing that's different about PHP is in JavaScript, when you want to put 2 strings together, you use the plus symbol like that. So it's MySQL host plus this other string plus DB name would create this long string. But in PHP, the period is the concatenation of it. So that's something you got to keep in mind too when you use PHP. And then I have this try. So I'm going to try this connection. If I get an error, then I'm going to echo this out on a terminal. But in this case, I don't think we'll run into a problem. And you could leave that off too. Knowing that all this is going to work, you could delete everything but this connection and then just put your variables in this line right here, in these 2 lines right here. That's all you really need for the beginning. But now that we know what we're going to call the database, we'll go over to MySQL and create it. Now this is what I use PHPMyAdmin. It comes with the XAMPP, and it gives you a GUI interface for the MySQL, so you don't have to do everything through the command line. In this case, we're going to create a new database. Click New. I'm going to call it Tester. I didn't have to worry about any sort of privileges or who's going to use it, because I'm just going to leave it root, so that way it should just work. And then it prompts you when you do it that way. It knows you're going to want at least 1 table. And we're going to use assemblies. So we're going to have 2 tables. So we'll have our assemblies or our parts and then the limits. I'm only going to have 3, but you can leave it at 4 because if you don't fill it out, it won't add it to it. And I'll show you that here. I'm going to leave it at 4. And you can see I've got 4 rows. That's why I call them rows. And I always have an ID. It's an integer. And then I go over here and I make it auto increment. And then that automatically assigns it as the primary key. So you can do searches on it a little bit quicker. And then I'm going to have, is it active? Is this assembly an active, currently the active assembly? And I'm going to add 4 in just to test, and we'll only have 1 active at a time. So I'm going to have it default to 0. And instead of an integer, though, I'm going to have a tiny int, because it's just going to be a 0 or a 1. If it's active, it's 1. If it's inactive, it's 0. And then the last field is going to be the part number itself. This will be a text or a varchar. I make it 25. It won't ever be that long. And I'm going to have it as defined. And I'm going to say enter part number. So if I see enter part number, then that means I never defined the part number. I like to give everything that I put a definition or a defined value that I know to check for that lets me know that I didn't enter it. And now I'll leave this one blank and you'll see that only 3 fields are added. And it's ID, active, and part number. And now I'm going to insert 4 different assemblies. And when you do this insert, it gives you the opportunity to do 2 at one time. I don't have to do the ID because it's going to auto increment. I'm going to make the first one active, and I'm going to make this real generic, part 001. I'm going to keep this one inactive and make it part 002. I'm going to go ahead and insert two more. Part 003 and part 004. And now if I click on it, you'll see that we have 4 records. It has the IDs 1 through 4. Only one of them is currently active. And then here's our part numbers. Now the next table we have to create is the limits. So you go over here and you click New. And you can tell that I've done this before. I went through this just to make sure that it would work. And so limits. But on this one, I'm going to have 10 fields. So I'm going to add 6 more because it comes with 4, and this will give me 10. And then once again, I always have my ID, and I come over here and I auto increment it. And then I need a date entered. Actually, I don't need this, but I like to have it on all the fields that I think that I might add and delete. And I make those timestamps. And you can make it be automatically set, so I don't have to actually enter it. It'll just, when I create the record, it'll set it to the current time. And then for the date deleted, it'll be another timestamp, but when I create it, I'm going to create it as a null. So in other words, it won't be anything. And then that way, I won't ever delete the records. I'll put a date in it, and then I'll know that it was deleted. And then when I do a query and I'm ever looking for the assembly numbers, I'll look for any date deleteds that are null when I'm looking for current parts. And then I'll have a history of old parts. So they'll never actually be deleted, but I'll just filter them based upon this date deleted. We're not going to get into that anytime soon, but if you want more on that, just send me an email or something. I'll explain that a little bit further. And then here's where this part number is going to be, or this limit is going to be assigned to an assembly. In this case, I'm just going to do the first 2 assemblies, but this would be the ID of 1 through 4. So each set of limits will be assigned to one assembly. Once again, it's an integer. I'm going to set it as defined to 0. There will be no assemblies with ID of 0. So if I see 0, then something went wrong in when I built it out. And now we've got volt upper and volt lower. And those I'm going to set up as floats, because that could be a decimal point could be in that. And I'm going to set them as defined to be 0. And then we have temp upper, temp lower, RPM upper, and RPM lower. And the temperatures can be decimal points too, so we're going to set that as a float, and that as a float. But the RPM upper and lower, they're probably just going to be integers. But once again, we'll define them all as 0, even the RPMs. Now we're set, we can create those. So now I have my limits, but now we need to add a couple of those too. We're going to insert 2. You have to worry about the top 3. And we're going to have assembly ID of 1 and 2. And I'm going to set this as 20 and 10, 50 and 40, 100 and 90. And then down here, we'll have part number 2. This we're going to do a lot smaller. We'll do 2, 1, 4, 3, 6, and 5. So that way we can tell the difference when we load them. Now if I look at my limits, I've got two sets of limits for part assembly 1 and assembly 2. And then under my assemblies, I have 4. And only one of them is active. And that's how we set that up. Now we're going to go back to the PHP. We're going to get this function variable based upon what we sent from JavaScript. So if you go back to JavaScript, in this form data, we have function and we have it set to get limits. If a variable called function, which is in this post instruction, is set, in other words, it sees function, because if I just executed the test.php script on its own through a command line, I wouldn't have that form data attached to it. And in that case, this would not be set, and then function would be assigned this no function text out here. But since we're going to call it and we're going to have function set in the post, we're going to assign this function variable whatever function is set to. And in this case, it'll be get limits. So once again, I'm using that ternary operator. I'm using it on this portion here. So if the post function is set and it sees it, then it's going to say true and it's going to do what's after the question mark and assign this to this function. If it doesn't see it, it's going to assign no function to function. And everything above this is generic. It'll be run whenever we run this page. But since this function itself is get limits, I'm putting a little divider up in here. And I'm going to run this part of the code if function is equal to get limits. We're going to run what's in this curly bracket. Else, we're going to send no function. And if you notice, I set this up kind of like an array because we're JSON encoding it. And I want it to come through as an array. So no will be assigned the word function. But it'll come through and you'll see it on the JavaScript return. And then in this first line here, this SQL query, we're going to prepare a text statement to become a query for PDO. And the nice part is if I select this and I copy it, I can go back to the SQL to this page and I can hit this SQL up here. And then I can paste it in here. And we're going to select the ID field from the assemblies table where active is like 1. Normally, you're probably used to using an equal sign or a double equal sign, but in SQL you use like. So where active is equal to 1, and then we're going to only get one record. So now when I go down here and hit go, you can see that I got the 1, because all we returned was the ID. I'll go back to this query box, and we'll change this to an asterisk. When you have the asterisk, it's going to return all the fields. And you can see we've got ID, active, and P001. So if you're not familiar with these query strings, they kind of make sense because you're going to do a select, and you put the fields that you want to select from this assembly. And what's kind of nice in PHP MySQL is it gives you a little cheaters over here. If I have this limit selected instead, and I do SQL, it shows you the fields for limits. So you can say list all from limits where, and we could change this to, you can take this volt upper and you can just double click on it, is like, I think we had a 50 in there. No, volts was the first one. So the volt upper, let's put 2. Select all from limits where volt upper like 2. And if I hit go, you can see it gave me 1 return. And that's assembly number 2, and volt upper is 2. So you can take what's in this PHP when you create a query, and you can go test it. And I like that in PHP MySQL. Now, after you execute this and you put it in this SQL query, it's not really in a format you can use. you have to do one more PDO command called fetch all. And what it does is it inserts into rows all of the rows that you collected. Now in our case, we're only going to collect one, but it still treats it as an array of arrays. So each row, all of the rows are an array, and then within each row, all of the fields are an array. So the first thing we have to do is we have to get a single row. So we're going to take that row's array, and we're going to get 0 because it's 0 base, and we're going to get the first row and store it in single row. And then I just want that assembly ID because we're looking for limits that are associated to the assembly that's currently active. So I need to get the assembly ID, which is going to be the first item in that single row, and we're going to store it in this assembly ID. And then we're going to create another query to get the limits based upon that assembly ID. So we can use that SQL query again. We'll just reassign it. We're going to prepare another query for MySQL. In this case, we're going to select everything from the limits table where the assembly ID is like the assembly ID that we just found. Now, the other nice thing about PHP is you can put a variable right within the string. You notice I'm not concatenating anything or doing anything like that. I just have these curly brackets around it. By doing that, you can put the string right in it. It'll ignore the curly brackets and just put this value right within the string itself. And then we're going to execute that. So at this point, we know that we have the first assembly as active, so we'll get the ID of 1. And then we're going to select all from limits where assembly ID like 1, and we're only going to get one record back. And then we need to get the rows out of that again. So we'll do this fetch all again, and we'll store it as rows. And then we're just going to send the first row back. We only did get one row, but we're still just going to do it just in case we got more than one for some weird reason. We're going to JSON encode that first row, and it's going to be a row. It's going to be an array itself with all the fields in it, and it's going to go back. Now, if you notice, I have this commented outline, which is the same command, but has PDO fetch underscore associated in it. And I'm going to come back to this. And that should be all that we need. So if you look at this test.js, this line right here points to this test.php. But if you look at this indexed, you have to have something that points to this test.js. I like to put this at the bottom, underneath the body. So everything is loaded, and then it's going to run this test.js. It's going to load, it's going to create this function, and then it's going to call this function, which is then going to call test.php. So we'll go over to the browser. And I've got the F12 over here. Hopefully you can see everything okay. I'll zoom in when I need to. I'm going to reload the page. We'll go to console. I'll reload the page. And you can see I got this note that says load limits, and you can see that we loaded the limits. And if you go to this network tab, and what it does is it shows each one of the calls to the PHP. In this case, we did one. We called it one time, and we sent function equal to get limits and hello equal to world. We didn't use this one. I just put it in there just for fun so that you could see it. And then what we got back was we got the data back twice. So this is an indexed array up here because it assigns a number to each piece of data that came back. And this down here is an associative array, and it uses words. I like the associated better because it just makes more sense to me. So I can take this volt upper, which is 20, and assign it to the volt upper over here. It's easier for me to follow. I'm going to go back to that PHP though for a minute. Now, right down here, I'm going to comment that line out and uncomment this one. So when the fetch all was left empty, it defaults to sending both indexed and associative array at the same time. But we can just call the associative array only. Now I'm going to run this again. And you can see this time we just got the associative portion of it. We don't get the numbers. Now the only other thing we'd like to do is we'll test it with the other data. So if we go back to here and I take my assemblies and I make 2 active, once I've deactivated 1, we go back to our web page and we restart it again. And you can see that we got the other limits. Now, just to show you something else, we'll go back here, see this. We're going to set 3 to active. And change this one to inactive. And we don't have an assembly for number 3. So now when I run it, you can see this doesn't populate. It still tried and called this test.php. It sent the get limits. It sent hello world. But what came back was there was an undefined array key in key 0 in your command. So if you were to go to look at line 28, there was something in here it didn't like, and probably what happened was it couldn't find anything, so there was no data, so it tried to JSON encode something that didn't exist. And then that's where you might go in here and you could, instead of preparing and doing this, you could have another line up here that just echoes it out and sends it out, and you could comment out these lines, because sometimes it's nice to see the SQL you think you're sending compared to what you are actually sending. And then you can cut and paste that and put that over into the database and try it that way if you want. So if I were to comment these out, so if I'm getting that error, and I just want to do a quick test, you can see here I would just select all from limits where assembly ID like 3. So then I can copy this, go back to here, click on my SQL, paste it in there, and hit go. You can see it worked, it ran, it just didn't find any records. And so that would be a sign to me to go, oh, I've got something wrong. And so then you would dig a little deeper. But you can use that echoing of data to go between PHP and JavaScript and then show it in your console or show it in the network, and that helps you figure some things out. So for this video, I showed you how to use JavaScript to access PHP to then access MySQL and return the data back. We need to come up with the Python portion next. And we'll have to add another table. We use like a diagnostics table is what I've been calling it. And then we'll use Python will set a bit in a field to 1. JavaScript will check that through PHP and say, is this a 1? If it's a 1, we're going to turn this light here to green. And at the same time, we're going to flip that bit to 0. So PHP will always be flipping it to 0. Python will always be flipping it up to 1. And so that way we'll know that they're talking to each other. But we'll get into that next. Well, that's about it for this video. If you like what you saw, consider giving me a thumbs up. And also consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.